here today to discuss the debate on who is the true author. Matthew Costello. There were undoubtedly a host of reasons Edward de Vere did not publish his works under his real name. One likely reason is that he may not have been prevented from doing so by the powers that be at the court. In Sonnet 66, Shakespeare complained of art made tongue-tied by authority, a well-said statement by Matthew Costello, an expert on Shakespeare, whom agrees with my partner and I that William is not the true author and is a coward for taking the credit of Edward de Vere's astonishing works. My partner and I say no, we do not believe that William Shakespeare is the true author of some of the greatest works on literature. Therefore, we stand resolved that the works of William Shakespeare should not be attributed to Edward de Vere. One of the points we'd like to talk about is education level. Shakespeare stopped schooling around age 14 or 15 and he never went to college. On the other hand, Edward graduated college at 14 and he studied law. William clearly did not have enough teaching, therefore he was not able to spell his own name, and he was barely penned at age 15 when Edward de Vere was around. Our second standpoint is no new writings came out after Edward de Vere died. To back it up, we did some research on how actually some writings did come out after he died, just kind of like Emily Dickinson. After she died, a lot of her plays and writings were published, just like hers. There were also a huge gap during William's time frame. Around that point, Edward had died, and nobody really has many records of Shakespeare. Our third standpoint is similarities in the personal life of Edward and the plays. Kurt Kreeler, an author from a book written about the mystery, quotes, "When Edward de Vere at one point was captured by pirates, it appeared in Hamlet mysteriously? I think not." Also, 25% of markings Edward had were biblical references in Shakespeare's writing. So the real question is, how would he really get all that work? I don't really think it's a coincidence. I think it's theft. And therefore, all the honor and glory should be given to the Earl of Oxford, aka Edward de Vere, someone who matches to all time, talent, and effort put into these plays and writings. I am now open for any questions or points of clarification.
Today I stand as the negative against that Edward de Vere is the author of Shakespeare's works. Some of the evidence we have found is that a quote from Richard Wagner, author of The Lost Secret of William Shakespeare, is the case of the de Vere as Shakespeare is based entirely on suppositions and extrapolations regarding the correlation between various places and events mentioned in some of the Shakespearean works with the travels and circumstances of de Vere's life. Such similarities do not constitute hard evidence beyond a reasonable doubt to establish de Vere as the author of the Shakespearean works. The hard evidence clearly shows that many of Shakespeare's plays and sonnets were written and revised long after de Vere's death in 1604. Such hard evidence for William Shakespeare is hard to refute, with most of Shakespeare's plays being written after de Vere's death. Plays such as Macbeth and The Tempest and many others were made years after Edward de Vere had died, in which how can someone who is dead write many different plays and sonnets and poems after his death? And so how can he be called the writer of Shakespearean works? Another thing we found that is even though Shakespeare did not have as much knowledge as Edward de Vere in such manners such as politics that having to do with like Queen Elizabeth, he still performed for Queen Elizabeth, and he still had some knowledge of history and literature from him going to school, even though he didn't finish all of his school. He also why did the story Hamlet, the play Hamlet was named after his deceased son, Hamlet Shakespeare, I think that's what his name is, and is also derived off the legend of Armleth, which Shakespeare could have had knowledge of from going to school and learning history. It's also off an older play called Hamlet, which is believed to have been revised and later become the play Hamlet that we know now. Another point is that why would someone have shares within the Globe Theater under the name William Shakespeare if he wasn't to be able to claim them later on under the name William Shakespeare, even though people knew that he was the Earl of Oxford. And that would be final. And I'm open for questions.
To refer back to the affirmatives cases, I did not hear a lot of sources, so didn't quite get where a lot of this information was coming from. And to their first contention about how there wasn't a lot of schooling involved in William Shakespeare's life, and there was a lot of schooling involved in Edward de Vere's life. Well, if you think about it, Edward de Vere was royal blood. He was about to become an earl or a duke, so they would have recorded where he was going, what he was doing, so that they could put that in his accolades, and so everyone could know he was smart because he went and did this, he was smart because he went to school here, and he studied this. And William was the son of who? So there's not really anyone who's going to mark down absolutely everything William's doing. So they say he stopped school at 14, but that's what everyone thinks. I mean, we're never going to really know unless we were there in that time, following him around, doing everything he was doing. And their second contention being coincidences in a couple of the plays and Edward de Vere's life. There's always going to be coincidences. I mean, there's going to be parts in life where this was recorded once and it's almost like deja vu. This happened to me and now it's happening in this, so it had to be, I mean, something in my life could have happened in William Shakespeare's pieces, but it doesn't mean I wrote them. And their third contention being that Edward de Vere had the life experience to be able to write these plays, and everything he's done could have easily influenced his plays so that he can do all of these things and he can write all these things and be such a great writer that he was, which Edward de Vere, with all of the stuff that was attributed to him, was a great writer. He did a lot of good things, but William was an avid reader. So he could have easily used all the books he was reading as inspiration to write these poems. And for all we know, Edward could have been an influence on William. William could have followed Edward de Vere's life, and he could have known what Edward de Vere was up to and what he was doing. So he could have easily found out their ways to write about his life. And it's as we know, this was all in the past, so we really have no clue what happened or who wrote these, and it'll always be a debate, but I still got to stand negative.
Okay, so according to the negative argument, we, as on the affirmative side, did not use very many sources when stating our facts. While listening to the negative argument, I myself only heard one source out of all of his argument, and it was from Richard Wagner, who was a supposed author, but he didn't claim of what. He just said an author. So he could not be a valuable source either. According to a documentary on the mystery of the whole William Shakespeare, Edward de Vere debate done by the WGBH Educational Foundation. William Shakespeare has only been known to document his own handwriting 6 times, 3 of which were in different copies of his will. And every time it was documented, almost every time his name was signed in a different penmanship. They don't have any actual recollection of any source that they could say this is his handwriting, because documented he could barely write. So how could someone who could barely write his own name, the same, like have his own signature, write 150 sonnets and 31 or 37 plays, excuse me. Another argument that they posed was that he barely wrote, or that Edward de Vere passed away in 1604. 12 plays were known to have come out after that year. And they said, how could he write plays if he was dead? Well, much like Emily Dickinson, who during her life, it was unacceptable for women to write at all. So all of her works, which is countless, she was an amazing author, and all of her works were published after her death by someone else. The same thing could have happened to Edward de Vere. He could have, seeing as how he didn't publish them himself and he didn't go by his own name, he could have had libraries and libraries full of plays that were published after his death, just like the great Emily Dickinson. One argument that I heard the negative side bring up was that there were shares to the Globe Theatre owned by a William Shakespeare. And his argument, or his supporting argument, was, why would shares be taken out under a name that doesn't exist? My partner and I would like to clarify that we're not saying William Shakespeare never existed. We are saying that he is not the true writer of any of the works laid under his name. Their other argument was that even though Edward de Vere was a part of the Queen's Court and had experience there, William also had some experience there because he performed as an actor in her court. During this time, a lot of the entertainment that was brought in was not, those entertainers were not treated as friends or anyone that would have a good amount of experience as knowing what goes on in the court. They would come in, do their piece, maybe have dinner once in a while, and then leave. They never stayed in the court, and they weren't a part of it. They didn't know what went on, so there was no way for a mere actor to know the in and outs of English court in order to write all of that poems and sonnets and plays. So with this being said, my partner and I still feel strongly that Edward de Vere is the true author of these plays and not William Shakespeare.
Just to rebuild on some of the points said here today, the negative side, I have come to a conclusion that, going back to what I said earlier about the big gap in William's life as soon as Edward de Vere died, there really wasn't a lot to say about him besides the start of his supposedly marvelous writings to like a big old gap on like how, when, where, why, and all that. And it goes from that, the beginning of his creation, to the middle, like his climax or downfall, I guess you could say, like how he owned part of the globe, like how did he get like part of the globe, if you know what I mean, and like how he lost his son, his only son Hamlet, stuff like that. You don't really know what leads up to that. And also what Damon had said on the negative side, or excuse me, what Isaac said on the affirmative side about how he preformed for Queen Elizabeth and stuff like that. That doesn't mean or give proof that he is the true writer. I mean, a lot of people could have went up and preformed for Queen Elizabeth and stuff like that. So I think that is kind of irrelevant to what we are here to talk about today. And we still stand strongly that we believe Edward de Vere is the true author, and no credit should be given to the so-called William Shakespeare. Who knows what his name is? Thank you.
Again, I stand here negative against that Edward de Vere is the true writer of Shakespearean works. And going back to what Deborah said about document and his handwriting, about how Shakespeare's handwriting, how he could barely even write his own name. Another thing is, like, how could Shakespeare, wait, never mind. Even though his handwriting was only found on 6 different pieces of paper and they were all signed differently, they all were on papers, like plays that were written by Shakespeare. And if Edward de Vere was the writer of the plays, it says that he published most of his works. That Edward de Vere published most of his poems with underneath his handwriting, underneath his name, even though it was discriminatory, even though it wasn't, you weren't supposed to at that time. Another thing is that the published work after the death of Edward de Vere, there were 12 plays, about 30 to 40 sonnets written after his death. And how could even though over his lifetime he wrote many things, I don't think he had enough lifespan to be able to write over 100 sonnets and 30 something plays within the so many years he had between his schoolwork and his death. And he had probably had other stuff to do during those times besides writing stuff. And to go back on what she said about the shares in the theater, well, I don't really have much for that. But yeah, that'll be it.
In summary, I would like to restate our position, and of which that we feel that the works of William Shakespeare should not be attributed to Edward de Vere, and mainly because of the facts that there's just, I would say our main point would be about how many plays were just written after his death. Now, if they were just published after his death, I could see how that would happen, such as Emily Dickinson, how she wrote all of her plays during her life, but she really couldn't publish them because it wasn't really accepted for women to write at that time. Then after she had passed away, it was some years later, they had decided to publish her works because, well, times had changed and females were now allowed to do more things. But I feel that these plays had to have been written after Edward de Vere's death, and something being written after you're dead by you is just not possible. So we feel Shakespeare should be attributed to these plays because I feel he worked hard for them, and he spent most of his life dedicated to the theater, dedicated to the arts, and somebody to spend all of their life doing things that they loved only to be questioned so many years later about how there's no way he could have done it. That just, I feel like he's rolling over in his grave. It's almost an insult. So I feel all of the works under the name William Shakespeare should be put towards William Shakespeare because worked so hard for something. I feel like he deserves credit. So.
just now, Damon said that the 12 plays that were written after his death, there's no proof, or they stated no proof, that these plays were written after his death, only that they were published. So, like I said, there's plenty of opportunities for them to have been published after DeVere died by someone else. With that being said, me and my partner still feel like there is not enough evidence in William's life supporting how he could have written so many sonnets and plays and poems with the education level and the eloquency that he did with such a little education and no proof of any kind of real education. So with that being said, we feel that the credit for these writings should be attributed to Edward de Vere.
In summary, I would like to restate our position, and of which that we feel that the works of William.
Yeah.